The winter of 1943 pressed down on the English countryside like a hand made of ice and fog. Morning came late and left early, and in between, the world existed in shades of gray that seemed to leach the color from everything they touched. At the airfield outside Cambridge, mechanics moved through the pre-dawn darkness, with their breath trailing behind them like small ghosts, their footsteps crunching on frost-hardened grass as they prepared the aircraft for another mission over the continent. Lieutenant James Halloran stood at the edge of the hard stand, watching his ground crew work on the P-47 Thunderbolt that would carry him into the sky. The machine was enormous, ungainly even, sitting there on the tarmac like some great metal beast that had been assembled from spare parts and stubborn American optimism. Its radial engine jutted forward with all the subtlety of a clenched fist, and its fuselage was thick and heavy, built around the largest supercharger ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. Other pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and not always with affection. Some called it worse things. Halloran had heard all the jokes. In the officers' mess, over weak coffee and weaker whiskey, the Spitfire pilots would lean back in their chairs and smile those knowing smiles, the ones that said they flew real fighters, elegant machines that danced through the air like swallows. They'd seen the Thunderbolts arrive, crated and heavy, and they'd watched the American pilots climb into those massive cockpits, and they'd laughed. Not cruelly, perhaps, but laughed nonetheless. The British had been fighting this war for years. After all, they knew what worked and what didn't. And this thick-bodied, brutish machine that looked more like a flying tank than a fighter seemed like exactly the kind of thing the Americans would build. All power and no grace. All muscle and no finesse. The German pilots had laughed too, or so the intelligence reports suggested. Radio intercepts caught their dismissive chatter, their confidence that this new American entry into the European air war would be easy prey. They flew Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, aircraft that had been refined through years of combat, machines that had swept the skies over Poland and France and Russia. What did the Americans know about air combat? What could this overweight newcomer possibly do against pilots who had been blooded in battles the Americans couldn't even imagine? Halloran pulled his leather jacket tighter against the cold and walked toward his aircraft. His crew chief, a sergeant from Oklahoma named Williams, looked up from the engine cowling and nodded. There was no need for words this early, this cold. They both knew their jobs. Williams had kept this bird flying through missions that should have torn it apart, and Halloran had brought it home when other pilots hadn't made it back. That created a bond deeper than language. The briefing had been short and direct. Escort duty. B-17 seconds were going deep into Germany, targeting aircraft production facilities near Leipzig, and the Thunderbolts would take them as far as their fuel allowed. It was never far enough. The range limitations had been the subject of endless discussion, endless frustration. The Spitfires couldn't reach that far either, but somehow that seemed acceptable when it was a British limitation. When it was American, it felt like failure. Halloran climbed the wing and settled into the cockpit, the familiar ritual bringing a strange comfort. Straps and buckles, switches and gauges, the smell of oil and metal and canvas. The canopy slid closed over him, and the world narrowed to this small bubble of instruments and sky. He ran through the pre-flight checks with the same careful attention he'd learned in training, back when Florida was warm and the war was something happening to other people in distant places. That seemed like another lifetime now, another world entirely. The engine coughed to life with a roar that shook the entire airframe, the big Pratt & Whitney radial settling into a deep, thunderous rhythm that you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. Around the field, other Thunderbolts were starting up, their engines adding to the symphony of mechanical power that announced the beginning of another day's war. Halloran watched the oil pressure gauge climb, watched the cylinder head temperature rise, checked and double-checked every instrument until he was satisfied that this machine was ready to do what it was built for. The tower gave them clearance, and one by one, the fighters began to taxi, their massive forms rolling toward the runway with a ponderous grace. Halloran waited his turn, then swung his aircraft into position and advanced the throttle. The Thunderbolt accelerated slowly at first, gaining speed with what felt like reluctance. But once it committed to the idea of flight, it moved with unstoppable momentum. The tail came up, the rumbling smoothed out, and then the wheels left the ground and England fell away beneath him. They climbed through layers of cloud that turned the world into cotton and shadow, the formation staying tight despite the limited visibility. Halloran kept his eyes moving, checking his wingman, checking the sky, checking his instruments, in an endless cycle of vigilance. Up here, inattention lasted about as long as it took a Messerschmitt to close the distance and open fire. He'd seen good pilots die because they'd looked away at the wrong moment, and he had no intention of joining them. Above the clouds, the sun was shining in a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the bomber stream stretched ahead of them like a river of aluminum and vapor trails. The B-17 seconds flew in their combat boxes, tight formations designed to concentrate their defensive firepower. But Halloran knew from bitter experience that no formation was tight enough to stop a determined attack. The bombers would need them today. They would need every fighter they could get. The flight across the channel was routine, almost peaceful. Below them, the white cliffs of Dover gave way to the dark waters of the North Sea, and then the coast of occupied Europe appeared on the horizon. Halloran felt his shoulders tense. This was enemy territory now. Every mile they flew took them deeper into a sky where people were actively trying to kill them, where radar stations tracked their progress and fighter units scrambled to intercept. The jokes about the jug seemed distant now, irrelevant. What mattered was whether this machine could do the job it was built for. The first German fighters appeared as dark specks against the high clouds, and the radio crackled to life with warnings and position calls. Halloran's pulse quickened, but his hands remained steady. Fear was useful, his instructor had told him once. Fear kept you alert. It was panic that killed you. He scanned the sky, trying to count the enemy aircraft, trying to estimate their tactics. They were Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, he thought, although at this distance it was hard to be certain. Aggressive, fast, heavily armed. The kind of opponent that had made a reputation for themselves over the past 2 years. The German fighters dove toward the bomber stream with that same aggressive confidence Halloran had seen before, and the American formation broke apart as each element moved to engage. Halloran pushed his stick forward and followed his flight leader into the attack, the Thunderbolt accelerating with a speed that still surprised him even after months of flying it. The dive performance was extraordinary, the heavy aircraft building velocity like a dropped stone. And suddenly the geometry of air combat shifted in ways the German pilots hadn't anticipated. A Focke-Wulf flashed across Halloran's nose, close enough that he could see the mottled camouflage pattern on its wings, and he hauled the stick back and around, trying to bring his guns to bear. The Thunderbolt responded with a heaviness that made him work for every degree of turn. But there was something else there too, something he was beginning to understand. This wasn't a dogfighting machine in the classic sense. It didn't want to turn with you. It wanted to use its strengths, its speed, and its weight, and its incredible ability to take punishment. The German pilot realized he had an American on his tail and broke hard to the left, climbing and rolling in a maneuver designed to shake pursuit. A Spitfire might have followed him through those gyrations, matching turn for turn in a ballet of physics and skill. The Thunderbolt couldn't do that. But Halloran had learned something in his brief time flying this machine. He didn't need to follow. He pulled up into a climb, using his speed to gain altitude, and then rolled over and came back down on a different angle. The Focke-Wulf was still turning, burning energy in those aggressive maneuvers, and Halloran had position and altitude and speed. He squeezed the trigger, and 8 50 caliber machine guns opened fire with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The convergence point was perfect. All that firepower focused into a cone of destruction that caught the German fighter across the wing root and engine cowling. Pieces flew off in a glittering spray of metal fragments, and then the Focke-Wulf was trailing smoke and falling away. No longer a threat, no longer anything but a defeated machine carrying a defeated pilot toward the earth below. Halloran didn't watch it fall. He was already scanning the sky for the next threat, already repositioning, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Around him, the air battle had dissolved into a swirling chaos of aircraft and tracer fire and desperate maneuvering. Another thunderbolt flashed past, pursued by a Messerschmitt 109 that was firing in short, precise bursts. Halloran rolled inverted and pulled through, converting altitude into speed, positioning himself for a shot. The Messerschmitt pilot never saw him coming. The 8 guns spoke again, and another German fighter staggered and broke away, trailing fire. But there were more of them, always more of them. For every fighter they drove off or shot down, 2 more seemed to appear. The German tactics were evolving, adapting to the presence of the thunderbolts. They stopped trying to dogfight and started using slashing attacks, diving from altitude with their superior climb rate, making a single pass and then running. It was smart, professional, the kind of tactics you'd expect from experienced pilots who'd survived years of combat. But the Thunderbolt had an answer for that, too. Halloran saw a pair of 109 seconds setting up for an attack on a struggling B-17 that had already lost an engine and was falling behind the formation. He didn't think, didn't calculate. He just reacted, pushing the throttle forward and pointing the nose at the lead Messerschmitt. The distance closed with shocking speed, the Thunderbolt accelerating in the dive like it had been designed for exactly this moment. The German pilot must have seen him at the last second because he broke off his attack and tried to dive away, but Halloran stayed with him, the heavy fighter refusing to be shaken, and when the range was right, he fired. The Messerschmitt came apart in the air, the airframe unable to withstand the concentrated fury of 8 machine guns at close range. Halloran pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him down into his seat, his vision tunneling at the edges, and when he leveled out, his wingman was there beside him, waggling his wings in acknowledgement. They'd stopped that attack. They'd saved that bomber. For today, for this moment, that was enough. The battle continued as they crossed deeper into Germany, a running fight that stretched for miles across the winter sky. The Thunderbolts stayed with the bombers, driving off attack after attack, using their speed and their firepower and their shocking durability to create a protective umbrella that the German fighters couldn't penetrate. Halloran watched one Thunderbolt take hits that should have been catastrophic, cannon shells punching through the wings and fuselage, and the aircraft just kept flying, kept fighting, the pilot apparently unaware that by all rights, he should be dead. The radial engine, it turned out, could absorb an incredible amount of damage. The air-cooled cylinders were arranged in a circle, and if 1 or 2 got shot out, the others kept running. There was no vulnerable liquid cooling system to rupture, no glycol to leak away and leave you with a seizing engine and a long glide home. The armor plating around the cockpit was thick enough to stop almost anything short of a direct hit from a cannon shell. And even then, pilots were coming home with stories of impacts that should have killed them, but didn't. The Jug was earning a new nickname, the Iron Horse, the plane that wouldn't die. Halloran checked his fuel gauge and felt the familiar tight knot in his stomach. They were at the limit of their range, the point where they had to choose between staying with the bombers or having enough fuel to make it home. The bomber crews called it the point of no return, and they faced it every mission, knowing that once they passed it, they were committed. For the fighters, the math was simpler, but no less cruel. They could protect the bombers for a certain distance, and then they had to leave them. After that, the bombers were on their own. The flight leader's voice crackled over the radio, terse and regretful. Time to turn back. Halloran took one last look at the bomber stream, at those heavy aircraft grinding their way toward the target with a courage that bordered on insanity, and then he banked his Thunderbolt toward home. Other fighters were doing the same, the escort peeling away in flights and elements, leaving the bombers to face the gauntlet alone. It felt like abandonment, even though everyone knew the reasons, knew the limitations. It still felt wrong. The flight back was longer than the flight out. It always was. Halloran flew on autopilot, his mind replaying the combat, analyzing his decisions, cataloging his mistakes. He'd gotten 2 confirmed kills, maybe 3, if the first Focke-Wulf had actually gone down instead of just running for home trailing smoke. But he'd also made errors, moments where he'd been too aggressive or too cautious, where he'd positioned himself poorly or misjudged a deflection shot. Those errors hadn't killed him today, but they might tomorrow. Air combat was an unforgiving teacher. They crossed the channel in loose formation, the fuel gauges reading uncomfortably low, and then England appeared ahead of them, green and gray and impossibly welcoming. The field called them in, and they landed in sequence, the heavy fighters, settling onto the runway with their characteristic firmness. Halloran taxied to his hardstand and shut down the engine, and in the sudden silence, he could hear his own heartbeat, too fast, too loud. Williams was there when he climbed out of the cockpit, already inspecting the aircraft for damage. Halloran counted the holes. 11. 11 hits that he'd never felt, never knew about until now. Some were small, rifle-caliber rounds that had passed through the control surfaces without doing much harm. Others were larger, cannon shells that had punched through the tough metal skin and kept going, missing vital components by inches or less. In a Spitfire, any one of those hits might have been fatal. In a Messerschmitt, certainly. But the Jug had taken them and brought him home. The debriefing was thorough and exhausting. Intelligence officers wanted every detail, every observation. How many enemy aircraft? What types? What tactics? How did the Thunderbolt perform? Halloran answered their questions mechanically, too tired to be diplomatic. The aircraft performed exactly as advertised, he told them. It was fast in the dive, stable in the attack, and nearly indestructible. What more did they want? In the officers' mess that evening, the atmosphere was different than it had been a month ago. The Spitfire pilots were still there, still drinking their tea and smoking their cigarettes, but the jokes had stopped. They'd heard the reports, seen the gun camera footage, talked to their own pilots who'd watched the Thunderbolts work. The cheap American fighter, the one they'd all dismissed, was racking up kill ratios that rivaled anything in the theater. More importantly, it was bringing pilots home, in a war of attrition that mattered more than elegance or grace. Halloran sat with his flight, nursing a drink he didn't really want, listening to the stories being told around him. Someone mentioned that the German pilots were changing their tactics again, becoming more cautious, more selective about when they engaged. The Thunderbolts had that effect. You couldn't treat them like the fighters you were used to. You couldn't dogfight them and expect to win. You had to use your advantages and avoid their strengths. And even then, those 8 guns and that armored cockpit made every engagement a calculated risk. The winter deepened, and the missions continued. Halloran flew almost every day, weather permitting, and each mission added to his understanding of the machine he flew. He learned to use the dive speed to set up attacks that gave the enemy no time to react. He learned to trust the armor when the tracers came close, to keep his aircraft between the enemy and home, always thinking about survival, always thinking about the next move. Other pilots were learning too, sharing their experiences, developing tactics that played to the Thunderbolt's strengths. The spring of 1944 brought longer days and clearer skies, and with them came the build-up to something everyone knew was coming, even if the exact details remained secret. More bombers arrived, more fighters, more pilots. The airfields of England were packed with aircraft, and the missions grew larger and more frequent. Halloran flew deep into Germany now, thanks to improved fuel tanks that extended their range. The joke about the short-legged American fighter had died, along with all the others. On a bright morning in April, Halloran was leading a flight of 4 when they encountered a formation of German fighters that outnumbered them 3-1. The smart move would have been to avoid the engagement, to stay with the bombers, and trust that the Germans wouldn't press an attack against such a strong escort. But the German pilots seemed confident, eager even. They'd been briefed, perhaps, that the Thunderbolts were overhyped, that American pilots were inexperienced, that numbers and skill would tell. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. Halloran's flight used every tactic they'd developed, every lesson they'd learned. They didn't try to turn with the more agile German fighters. They used their speed, their firepower, their ability to dive away and then come back with energy and position. They fought as a team, covering each other, setting up shots, refusing to be drawn into the kind of individual combat where the German pilots' experience might have given them an edge. When it was over, 6 German fighters were falling from the sky, and all 4 Thunderbolts were heading home. The gun camera footage from that fight made its way through intelligence channels and ended up being shown to bomber crews as part of their briefings. "See?" the officers would say, pointing at the screen. "This is what your escort can do. This is why you keep formation, why you maintain discipline, why you don't give up, even when it seems hopeless." The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of something larger than itself, a promise that the massive American industrial machine could produce weapons that were not just adequate, but superior. Halloran never watched the footage. He knew what had happened. He'd been there, lived through it, felt the fear and the adrenaline and the strange clarity that came in combat. Watching it later, sanitized and silent and projected on a wall, seemed wrong somehow. It reduced something visceral and terrifying to entertainment, to propaganda. He preferred to remember it the way it had actually been, with all the messy details intact. The German pilots stopped laughing. Intelligence reports confirmed it through various sources. Radio intercepts showed a new respect, a new caution. The Thunderbolt was being discussed in Luftwaffe briefings as a serious threat, an opponent to be treated with the same care they'd give to any elite unit. Tactics were being written specifically to counter it. That was, in its own way, a form of success. When your enemy had to change the way they fought because of you, you were doing something right. But with respect came increased danger. The German pilots who survived their encounters with the Thunderbolts learned, adapted, became more skilled. They stopped making the mistakes that had cost their comrades. They developed hit-and-run tactics, using their climb rate to attack from above and then escape before the heavier American fighters could respond. They targeted damaged bombers, knowing the escorts couldn't be everywhere at once. The air war became a deadly chess match, each side trying to anticipate the other's moves. Halloran's squadron lost pilots, not as many as they might have in lesser aircraft, but enough to hurt, enough to leave empty chairs in the mess and quiet moments where someone would start to say something to a pilot who was no longer there. Some went down over Germany and spent the rest of the war in prison camps. Others simply disappeared, their aircraft last seen falling through clouds or into the North Sea. No parachute, no radio call, just gone. War consumed everything it touched, and no amount of armor or firepower could change that. In June, the invasion came, and the nature of the air war changed again. The Thunderbolts shifted roles, becoming ground attack aircraft as well as fighters. The big radial engine that had seemed like a liability in the design phase became an asset, powerful enough to carry bombs and rockets along with the internal armament. Halloran found himself diving on German tanks and supply columns, using the same aggressive tactics he'd developed for air combat, trusting the same armor that had saved him from cannon fire to protect him from ground fire. The aircraft proved as devastating in this role as it had in air-to-air combat. The 8 machine guns could shred soft-skinned vehicles and suppress anti-aircraft positions. The bombs, while crude compared to dedicated attack aircraft, were effective enough when delivered from a steep dive by a pilot who'd learned precision under fire. The Luftwaffe tried to interfere, but there were Thunderbolts waiting for them now. Veteran pilots who knew every trick and had no patience for games. By summer's end, Halloran had flown more than 50 combat missions. His Thunderbolt bore the scars of dozens of engagements, patches, and repairs covering damage that would have been irreparable in any other aircraft. Williams kept it flying through a combination of skill, dedication, and what seemed like sheer stubbornness. The aircraft had become more than a machine. It was a partner, a protector, something he trusted with his life every time he climbed into the cockpit. The jokes were long forgotten now. Nobody called it cheap anymore, at least not within earshot of the pilots who flew it. The statistics told a story that needed no embellishment. Kill ratios, survival rates, mission completion percentages, all the cold numbers that reduced human experience to data points on charts, they all favored the Thunderbolt. German aircraft production was being strangled by the constant raids, and the Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. The air superiority that had once seemed unattainable was becoming a reality. In September, Halloran was promoted to captain and given command of a flight. He stood in front of the new pilots, fresh from training, their faces young and eager and terrifyingly naive, and he tried to tell them what they needed to know. "Trust your aircraft," he said. "Don't try to make it do things it wasn't built for, but understand what it can do and use those strengths. Fly as a team. Watch your wingman's back and trust him to watch yours. Don't take stupid risks, but don't hesitate when the moment comes." They nodded and took notes, and he wondered how many of them would survive long enough to truly understand. The war ground on through autumn and into another winter. The missions continued, the losses mounted, the victories accumulated. Halloran flew until flying became automatic, until he could navigate by dead reckoning and shoot by instinct and land in weather that kept other pilots grounded. His Thunderbolt became an extension of his will, responding to the lightest touch, anticipating his needs. Williams kept it running through parts shortages and maintenance nightmares and problems that should have grounded it for weeks. In December, they were briefed for a mission that seemed impossible. Bombers were going after oil refineries deep in Germany, and the fighter escort would be stretched to the absolute limit of their range. Every Thunderbolt would be carrying external fuel tanks that had to be dropped before combat, and even then, the fuel margins were razor thin. One miscalculation, one navigation error, one unexpected headwind, and pilots would be ditching in the North Sea or bailing out over enemy territory. But the oil was strangling the German war machine, and the mission had to be flown. They took off in the pre-dawn darkness, a stream of heavily laden fighters climbing into clouds that seemed to have no top. Halloran flew on instruments, trusting the gauges, trusting his training, trusting the aircraft to get him through. Around him, unseen, the rest of the squadron did the same, each pilot alone in his small bubble of metal and plexiglass, connected to the others only by radio and faith. The clouds broke over Germany, and the winter sun revealed a landscape covered in snow, beautiful and deadly. The bomber stream was ahead of them, already under attack from German fighters that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Halloran dropped his external tanks and advanced the throttle, and the Thunderbolt responded with that familiar surge of power that still thrilled him after all these months. They dove into the fight with the confidence of veterans, no longer questioning whether their aircraft could do the job, knowing it could, knowing they could. The air battle was savage and confused, aircraft twisting and diving and firing at ranges that would have been impossible months ago. Halloran shot down 2 Focke-Wulfs in quick succession, textbook attacks that left no room for error or escape. His wingman got another, and together they drove off 3 more that had been setting up on a crippled B-17. The bomber crew waved from their positions, and Halloran rocked his wings in acknowledgement before turning back toward the fight. But the fuel gauges were dropping faster than he'd calculated, and the return flight was going to be desperate. He made the call, started gathering his flight, pulling them away from the combat even though the bombers were still under attack, even though every instinct said to stay and fight. The mathematics of fuel were absolute, unforgiving. They had to leave now, or they wouldn't make it home at all. The flight back tested everything he'd learned about fuel management and navigation. He leaned the mixture until the engine ran rough, then enriched it slightly, finding that perfect balance between economy and reliability. He adjusted the altitude, the propeller pitch, every variable he could control, stretching each gallon as far as it would go. The channel appeared ahead of them, gray and cold and impossibly wide, and he calculated their remaining fuel and the distance to the coast, and felt his stomach tighten. They crossed the English coast with their fuel gauges reading empty, the engines still running on whatever remained in the lines and the tanks. The field was there, just ahead, and Halloran called the tower and told them he had 4 aircraft coming in on fumes. They cleared everyone else out of the pattern and gave him priority, and he brought them in one at a time, each thunderbolt touching down and rolling to a stop before its engine coughed and died from fuel starvation. All four made it. They'd flown the mission everyone said was impossible, and they'd come home. Winter turned to spring one more time, and with it came the sense that the end was approaching. The German Air Force was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting casualties, but it was no longer the force it had been. The steady attrition, the loss of experienced pilots, the fuel shortages, the bombing of production facilities, all of it had taken its toll. The Thunderbolts ranged across Germany almost unopposed now, attacking targets of opportunity, supporting the ground forces, maintaining a presence that reminded everyone who controlled the sky. Halloran flew his 100th mission in April 1945, and they threw him a party in the officers' mess. He stood there with a drink in his hand, accepting congratulations from pilots who'd been civilians a year ago, and he thought about all the missions, all the combat, all the times he'd climbed into that cockpit not knowing if he'd come back. The Thunderbolt had brought him through all of it, had taken hits that should have killed him and kept flying, had given him the tools he needed to survive and fight and win. In May, the war in Europe ended. The official announcement came through, and across England, airfields erupted in celebration. Pilots who'd been flying combat missions hours ago were now drinking and laughing and dancing with the WAAFs, releasing tension that had built up over months and years of constant danger. Halloran walked out to the hardstand where his Thunderbolt sat, the same aircraft he'd flown on his first mission, scarred and patched and still somehow whole. Williams was there, as he always was, working on some minor maintenance issue even though there would be no more missions, no more combat. The sergeant looked up when Halloran approached, and for a long moment, they just stood there, two men who'd shared something that couldn't quite be put into words. They'd kept each other alive, pilot and crew chief, each doing their part, each trusting the other completely. The aircraft would be going home, Halloran learned later, not to a museum or a scrapyard, but back to the United States, to be examined and studied and eventually retired with honor. It had earned that. It had proven itself in the crucible of combat, had shown that the jokes and the doubts and the dismissive laughter had been wrong. The cheap American fighter had been deadlier than anything Germany built, not because of any single attribute, but because of how it all came together. The speed and the firepower and the durability and the pilots who learned to use those strengths. Halloran put his hand on the worn metal skin, feeling the rivets and the patches, the scars of battle worn like medals. He thought about all the pilots who hadn't made it home, who'd trusted their aircraft and done everything right, and still died because war was random and cruel and indifferent to skill or courage. He thought about the bomber crews who'd made it to the target and back because fighters like this one had kept the German pilots away from them. He thought about Williams and the thousands of other mechanics who'd worked through the night to keep these machines flying. The Thunderbolt sat silent on the hardstand, its engine cold, its guns empty, its war over. It looked exactly like it had that first morning in the winter of 1943, ungainly and brutal, and somehow perfect. The pilots had stopped laughing. The Germans had stopped laughing. Everyone who'd seen it fight, who'd watched it take punishment and keep coming, who'd tried to shoot it down and failed, they'd all learned the same lesson. Sometimes the measure of a machine isn't grace or elegance. Sometimes it's the ability to do the job, day after day, mission after mission, bringing the pilots home to fly again. Sometimes it's the strength to take a hit and absorb the damage and keep flying when any other aircraft would have fallen from the sky. Sometimes it's the simple, brutal effectiveness of 8 machine guns and a pilot who knows how to use them. Halloran walked away from the hardstand as the sun set over the English countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Behind him, the Thunderbolt sat in the gathering darkness, a shadow among shadows, its war done but its story just beginning. Somewhere, in archives and after-action reports and the memories of those who'd flown it, the truth would be recorded. The cheap American fighter, the one everyone laughed at, had helped win the air war over Europe. It had proven itself in combat, earned respect through performance, and written its name in history with gunfire and courage, and the unshakable determination to bring every pilot home. The laughter had stopped a long time ago. In its place was something quieter, something deeper: respect, gratitude, recognition that sometimes the underdog surprises everyone, even themselves. The Jug, the Iron Horse, the Thunderbolt, whatever name you gave it, it had done what it was built to do, and it had done it better than anyone dared hope. In the end, that was all any weapon of war could ask for: to serve its purpose, protect its pilots, and earn its place in the story that would be told for generations to come. The P-47 Thunderbolt had done all that and more. It had flown into doubt and emerged as legend, had faced the best Germany could field and proven superior, had carried young pilots through impossible missions and brought them home to live another day. The war was over, but the memories would last forever. Somewhere in America, factories would close and workers would go home, and the massive production lines that had built these aircraft would fall silent. The Thunderbolts would be parked in rows, thousands of them, waiting for decisions about their fate. Some would be scrapped, their metal recycled into peacetime goods. Some would be sold to allies or stored against future need. A few would be preserved, kept as reminders of what had been accomplished. But for the pilots who'd flown them in combat, who'd trusted their lives to that radial engine and those armored cockpits, the Thunderbolt would never really be gone. It would live on in their memories, in the stories they told their children, in the quiet moments when they remembered what it felt like to climb into that cockpit and take off into uncertain skies. They'd remember the weight of it, the sound of it, the way it handled in a fight. They'd remember the times it saved their lives, the times it brought them home when nothing else could have. And maybe, in some distant future, people would look at photographs and ask questions, and the old pilots would smile and start their stories the same way. They laughed at it, they'd say. Everyone laughed. The British, the Germans, even some of our own people. They said it was too heavy, too expensive, too crude. They said it would never work. And then we took it into combat, and it proved every one of them wrong. It wasn't the cheapest fighter we built, but when you measured the cost in lives saved and missions accomplished, when you counted the pilots who came home because of what that aircraft could do, it was worth every penny and more. Halloran stood at the edge of the airfield one last time before he left England for good, watching the sun rise over rows of parked Thunderbolts that would never fly again. The war had ended, and with it, the urgent need for machines like these. But they'd done their part, done it well, done it with a competence that had surprised everyone except the pilots who'd flown them. They'd laughed at the cheap American fighter, right up until the moment it proved deadlier than anything Germany built. And then the laughter stopped, replaced by something better, something earned through blood and courage, and the simple refusal to give up. That was the story Halloran would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not the kills or the missions or the narrow escapes, but the knowledge that he'd been part of something that mattered, something that had made a difference. He'd flown the aircraft everyone dismissed, and he'd helped prove them wrong. That was enough. That would always be enough. The sun cleared the horizon, and the Thunderbolts gleamed in the early morning light, their metal skins reflecting the dawn of a new era. The war was over. The world would rebuild. And somewhere in the future, historians would study these aircraft and write their reports and draw their conclusions. But for those who'd been there, who'd lived it, the truth was simpler and deeper than any analysis could capture. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been laughed at, doubted, and dismissed. And then it had gone out and done its job with a competence and effectiveness that silenced every critic. It had saved lives, won battles, and earned its place in history. That was the real story, the one that mattered. Everything else was just details.